it is fantastic that you've all come along today. I'm particularly glad that people have travelled from such long distances away, particularly the Cork crew. 7 people coming across from Cork is fantastic. I think it's excellent. John came again, John Baker, who made such an important contribution on the last conference. Joe Richardson, who's come up from Peterborough. So that's, I think that's where you skirted up the east of the country, which is, yeah, east side's the best side. Yeah, east side. And of course we've got here today as well 2 representatives, 3 shortly, representatives from Ashington. Vicky Gallagher, who the Cork crew have met back in June, and Gibson Burrell, who is professor at Leicester University, and who I think left Ashington in 1966.
Yeah, when it was at its height, probably.
Yeah. And who will be making a series of critical contributions to discussions about Ashington.
Okay.
So there's going to be a range of contributions, I think, today and tomorrow from people with regard to Ashington. And I think it's very important that we think in this context about towns like Ashington, which have at various different points in their history been quite successful sites of collective organisation as they've resisted a whole range of deleterious and difficult circumstances. I think by having people like Gibson and Tony Bennett, who will be on later, who's in his 50s, we'll be able to track the various different ways in which communities have dealt with different challenges and have been undermined systematically by a whole range of different forces, I guess. Vicky is someone, obviously a young person who's lived in Ashington for a couple of years, but obviously is a Northumbrian like me, and has experienced Ashington as it deals with a whole range of challenges in the 21st century. So I think when the work on this project started, the broader project about good culture started, I had an interest in the fate of towns like Ashington, precisely because my family had come from these sorts of towns. And I think one of the big things that's emerged from the broader project on good culture is the way in which very different communities have come to similar sorts of circumstances in very, very different ways, but with similar sorts of problems resulting from those shifts in circumstances. So originally the idea of engaging with people from Ashington lay in the notion that this was a community which was functioning in a whole range of different important ways. We shouldn't romanticise it, we shouldn't overestimate the extent to which people flourished, but it was functional and it produced a whole range of different goods which were very important. You could see other communities, very different communities like those in Aboriginal Australia, which were functional and successful by any measure, any neoliberal measure, really. They were functional and self-sufficient, they were productive, and they've been changed and they've been altered in a whole range of interesting ways. So the idea originally was about involving people from these communities in discussions about their futures, and to see people who live in these communities as, in some way, experts on their lives and experts on the culture, their shared understandings, which underpin those communities. And the idea was that if we were to bring people from very different backgrounds together to talk about the circumstances which have brought them to their precarious or even more deleterious circumstances in the present, we might be able to identify the essence of good culture. What is it that these communities have done in their different circumstances which have enabled them to deal with natural and social pressures in successful ways? The idea of participatory research was also grounded in the notion that people who have been excluded systematically from political processes ought to be involved in discussions about their future. They ought to have the capacity to participate in discussions, political discussions about their future. They ought to be able to have a say in the way in which their communities develop. And it's in everybody's interest that people be involved in those discussions. Not simply within those communities, but in societies in general, because people who are alienated from broader societies not only struggle for themselves, but they also the pressures emerge within society in a broader scale as a result of that alienation and exclusion. So there was a prima facie, there was an initial thought that people should be involved in participatory research, and the likes of Vicky, who's a community organiser from Ashington, was central to the organisation of research in Ashington, and she went, of course, across to Brisbane and conducted research there with a whole range of community researchers, not only from Ashington but also from Aboriginal groups around Brisbane, Australia. So today is a means of just picking up on a couple of the discussions that we had at the first event, a series of discussions that we had during our visit to Cork, which Mary, Vicky and I undertook in June, which led to a whole range of fruitful discussions, I thought, and to also think about ways in which we can develop principles for participatory research which are intelligible to communities themselves. So we've got a range of different sessions today. This is just an initial session to try to flag up these things to discuss, really. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about the EcoWorld project, which Denis has kindly agreed to start a discussion on, which is a community initiative which is taking place in Cork at the minute, but it's also been applied in different contexts. We're going to be talking about the development of a guide for communities working with academics, which Vicky is going to lead. So I think Vicky's going to take the lead in developing that guide with us. So that'll be interesting. People are from a range of different backgrounds, academic backgrounds. It's probably slightly ironic that at a conference on participatory research or a project which involved participatory research, there should be so few people from community backgrounds themselves. That's a result of a range of different factors. I think it's quite difficult to get people have jobs, obviously, like academic positions entail trips to conferences and stuff like that. It's very difficult to get out of work, obviously. Tony's going to be coming along later, Tony Bennett, who's an older guy from Ashington. It's unfortunate that a couple of the people who were really instrumental in making the visit to Cork really enjoyable when we were there weren't able to make it. That was unfortunate, and I suppose an avenue of discussion which we can't necessarily pursue as a consequence of that, which is a shame, I think, for all of us. Okay, to start with then, I think I'd just like to start by asking Seamus, I suppose one of the nice things about the trip to Cork when we, Vicky, Mary, who's an Aboriginal traditional woman, went across, was just the sheer range of different avenues of discussion which interlinked with one another. And I suppose just to set us up for a discussion about good culture, what it means to have a good life, would you be able to provide us some of what you took from that event, or how you saw the links emerging between the communities?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the interesting things from that and from other work we've done is that I suppose a lot of these very marginalised groups have had to fall back on their resources in ways that maybe more mainstream or more ones that are linked into the sort of main economic activity don't have to do. And for me, I think, and I suppose we've been reminded this very much in the last couple of weeks in terms of the torrent of rain that's fallen in Ireland, in terms of the challenges that could be faced in terms of climate change and things like this, that they have developed strategies, resilience strategies that I think are really, really important in terms of where we go and how we meet these kind of challenges. And I think it's not unconnected to the wider problem we have at the moment in terms of terrorism and so on, in terms of what is a good life. And a lot of the people who are responding and creating huge turmoil and causing mayhem and death in the world are doing so because they don't have a good life themselves, and they don't have a concept or sense of a good life. And I think there's a challenge for us to say, okay, look, how can we begin to understand the world in a different way that gives people a good life and gives people a good sense of culture and so on and so forth. And I think there are challenges in a lot of different directions for us there. I think there are micro level challenges which are around recognising people's individual dignity and respecting their traditions and respecting their views of the world and so on and so forth. And I think there's a lot of challenge of this really in today's world, where sometimes what people are and what people are about, we do a little bit of lip service, but we condescend towards people and we dismiss them and so on and so forth. I think that's a big challenge for us. And I think for me, I suppose what was happening in Cork, and I think your visit helped us, and I think this is probably a common theme, that when we start to engage with external groups, we have to look at ourselves as well, and we can see a lot of things that we don't do well and things we do well. Mary Graham, when she spoke at the Traveller Visibility Group Centre that day, to me was one of the most inspiring events I think I was ever at, because most of you probably know Mary or you've encountered Mary. She's a really soft-spoken woman and really kind of humble, and a woman who kind of doesn't put herself forward as a leader or as a kind of a charismatic type of person. She doesn't present herself as that. She doesn't say that's what she is, but in fact she is. And in a very soft-spoken way, I think she really kind of brought out values that we know are important, but often get dismissed and sidelined because of more important things like the economic good and all these kinds of nonsense that we get ourselves bought into, saying is more important than what is really important. And that to me was really a critical part of what happened in Cork. And I think as a consequence of that and other things, and I've had good discussions with Denis and others about it, I think there's something going on in Cork as well, that is kind of almost happening, and we haven't fully appreciated what's happening, and it's going on for a long time. And this is a sort of a wider community I've engaged. The CESCA project, I think, is an example of that, and EcoWell is an example of that, and there are lots of other little things that are happening that are examples of something that's a little bit different. And it probably doesn't even get picked up on the mainstream in Cork, that there are lots of things happening beneath the surface a little bit that doesn't get into the media and doesn't get picked up even in research and doesn't get picked up in literature very much. But there's something going on, there's something about the way people are connecting and networking, which I think is really, really important. And I think we need to nurture that, and we need to understand it in a broader sense. And I think this is where the first day that I met you was right in the middle of the summer in Cork, and the heavens opened as well. And we had a very small group. But I just felt that what you were talking about was really, really important, and some of the things you spoke about Ashington as well, I think are really important lessons for us to stand back a little bit and say, look, what are these people talking about, and what are the practices, and what are the ways that people communicate with each other, and what are the ways that people support each other? Because there's a word that has been started to be rooted out of our culture and our language and our way of understanding since, I would say, sorry for coming back to some great English person here, but Margaret Thatcher began a process of taking away the word solidarity out of our way of thinking and our way of communicating and our way of understanding the world. And we were waiting in the train station in Newcastle. We also had a commenting on the train station itself. What a wonderful piece of architecture it is. What a wonderful public building it is. And the thought that struck me was, this is the product of a society that had a pride in itself, that believed in public building, that believed in creating a public good, that said, okay, we're going to make something that's bigger than we are. We're going to create a great society. And Britain has some of the world's greatest institutions. I know people will criticise the BBC, and they will criticise the railway network, and they will criticise institutions like the British Library and the British Museum and all of these kinds of things. But these are world-level institutions. And these are things that have an intrinsic value for the world, not just for people in Britain. And I think once you kind of see an insidious chipping away at those values, here when you visit. That's what always strikes me when I come back and I say, oh God, you know, do people here not realise, you know, the value, the intrinsic value of what they've got, and why isn't that cherished and why isn't it developed? And I'm sure the same thing is happening in Ireland. And this strikes me about the people in Ballyphehane we worked with recently. And I come from a rural background where it was very closely networked and there was a lot of solidarity and so on and so forth. But I actually feel that in this community, which is an urban community, has much more of those values now than the place I left. And I think there's so much learning and there's so much of a challenge for us there, you know, that we really need to start doing something about it.
Okay, brilliant. So that's a really nice summary of the sort of discussions that we had when we were in Cork. Gibson, without throwing this on you, well, I am throwing it on you, sorry. I suppose Seamus talked about a range of things, the importance of solidarity, the importance of intrinsic values, the importance of public spaces, these sorts of things. As a man who grew up in Ashington during its heyday and who's witnessed elements of its decline, can you see elements of those trying to fix good things in the way that Ashington was?
Yeah, I think historically though, one has got to look at the central station. I don't know about the history, but a lot of that money was commercial, you know, rather than municipal. So one's got the immediate problem about St Pancras Station was built on Bass, the brewery's money, rather than any kind of sense of municipalism. Yeah. So you know, there's a hidden history almost there of capital as well, capital investing in that sort of infrastructure. So that's the first thing. But Ashington itself, the Ashington Coal Company was of local business people, but the Duke of Portland was the key source. And the bridge that we probably see across the Wansbeck, the Duke of Portland charged 6p for every tonne of coal that crossed. And the trains, which ran all day, were 30-tonne trucks, 30 trucks each. So that money was being siphoned off from the Ashington Coal Company. But the Duke of Portland, in terms of infrastructure, which you may or may not regard as central, alcohol, the Duke of Portland was a teetotaler. So he said, on the land that I own, nobody's going to be able to drink because it's bad for the workers. It stops them working. So there were 2 pubs allowed, one called the Portland Arms for some reason, and the other was called the Grand Hotel, which was for visitors. And then there was one built later called the White Elephant, and it was called the White Elephant because nobody was going to drink there. And so the miners built 56 working men's clubs. So the infrastructure was built not by the owners, not by Ashington Council, and of course Ashington was always a village. It was never had a mayor. It was never a municipality in that sense. So it was built by the workers, you know, for the workers. So is that romantic? Probably. But I think, you know, once one looks at ownership and why things were the way in which they were, like the central station, you know, there are different layers that one has to excavate, I think.
But it's interesting the solidarity there, isn't there? I mean, the working men and the working classes really who built those things were doing it out of a sense of solidarity, weren't they?
Certainly the clubs they were.
Yeah.
Building that sort of thing, you can imagine that the builders, you know, shared particular sorts of orientations. Yeah, and I mean, solidarity was what I remember. I don't know what it's like now, Vicky, but I mean, solidarity was the key way of it, and it wasn't necessarily that pleasant. You know, there are forms of solidarity which can be quite unpleasant. Yes. But the solidarity was certainly there, and it was often based on labourism. My dad was always a non-supporter of the Labour Party. What he saw as the alternative power structure were the Freemasons. So there were two parallel systems, and he thought the Labour Party were corrupt. And without being on camera, I could name the families in Ashington that were. One of them turned out to be an academic.
Right, so.
Not corrupt at all. Yeah, so the power structures were there, but they weren't necessarily solidaristic in an undifferentiated sort of way. There were cross-cutting ties. So the street I'm from, Rosalind Street, was for the deputies. So the deputies in the structure were not the overmen who were responsible for production of coal. The deputies were responsible for safety. So guess which, wins out in terms of priorities. The overman says we've got to produce that. The deputy said no, we can't. It's against safety rules. So guess who won? So there were status differentiations in Ashington. So the street I'm from was the houses were a bit bigger than the normal ones. People said, well, you lived in the overman's sort of street. But the thing is that there's a phrase, and I'll shut up in a second, sorry. There was a phrase at the time which is really relevant to the precariat, and the phrase was, somebody has a colliery house. Now that meant you were totally established for life. And if somebody kept appearing on TV, let's pick Benedict Cumberbatch out of the air for some reason, my mother would have said he's got a colliery house, which means that he's totally secure, he's got a job for life. And that's the opposite of the precariat. If you got a colliery house, you had free coal, you had a job for life, you had security, whereas all of that is gone. So built into the structures were that security. And I think it's along with solidarity, but people think, I've got a job for life. There's always going to be a desire for coal. And it's when that goes that the precariat kind of comes into existence.
Do you find that, you talked about the shift in way in which the community that you grew up in dealt with something like solidarity, was that due to the decline of farming in Ireland, or how can you trace that?
Well, I think Gibson says is very true. I mean, a lot of the solidarity had negative aspects to it as well, because in the sense that people knew who you were, not just as yourself, but as the 3-4 generations that were before you. So that could have a lot of baggage for you. So it could mean good things or bad things, or a combination of good and bad things. But I think the reason for the solidarity, maybe the strength of the solidarity, was that people were dependent upon each other, and in order to be safe and secure, you actually did depend on your neighbours and so on and so forth. But I think what's interesting here, when you're talking about the trains, it reminded me of Saudi Arabia, and the oil is going out in pipes, and you look at if you compare what they have done with their wealth as opposed to what happened here with the wealth. I mean, in 100 years, what will Saudi Arabia have to look back on? So, I can see where you are with some of it, and in the building of the station and so on and so forth. But at some level, although it might have had a commercial interest for somebody, it certainly still was building something that had a wider intrinsic value. So there's a difference.
I agree, and I hear what Gavin is saying about when the economy transforms, it does throw up the precariat and the vulnerability. But if we look at the Irish infrastructure for a moment, we've got a flood crisis in Ireland at the moment. We've set up a new white elephant called Irish Water. We've got a rail system which doesn't function. We have the grand stations as well. Interestingly enough, they're all legacies of our pre-independence era. The Irish state hasn't invested in public infrastructure in 100 years.
Except for roads.
Well, except for roads, which has meant lack of investment in the public, the collective infrastructure. People use railways. The water system hasn't been invested in for 100 years. So there's been a huge sort of neglect of that civic infrastructure, both in physical terms and also in terms of saying this is what a decent and civilised society should provide for its citizens. We've just come from Glasgow, spent a week there with a group of students, and when you talk about the networks that are operating and how people are practicing solidarity, we saw so many examples of it during the week. I'll give you an example. We visited the Scottish Poverty Alliance yesterday, And they are celebrating the 20,000 worker being admitted to the living wage campaign. And this is a huge achievement on their part. It's two guys working within the Scottish Poverty Alliance. And so this is a good news story. And they're now establishing an accreditation system where good employers will be celebrated and acknowledged, which will create more pressure on other employers to join this. I think that's where the solidarity is being expressed. It's through sort of establishing networks of decency, and that's where the good life comes from. The living wage, I think, is £3, I think, more than the minimum wage, which is a substantial difference. And you know, when it comes to making choices, people can now earn a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. So I think that, you know, like in Cork, the networks of solidarity are working quietly, and there, you know, there's not going to be a big bang, but there's a huge incremental change taking place. And there were so many other organisations we visited, like people working in the prisons, in art and music programs, keeping families together, making sure relationships between fathers and their children are sustained while fathers are in prison and so on. You know, that's the kind of work that is contributing to good life, as I would see it. You know.
Vicky, I know you're really ill and everything, but despite the snot, how do you see solidarity operating or existing, if it does, in Ashington?
I think it goes on many levels. So you've got solidarity between old school solidarity, where men used to go down and mine and work with each other, and it would be life and death. You know, you have to build up trust in someone enough, and that brings solidarity to trust them with your lives. You know, if they don't do their job properly, they're putting your life at risk. So people were a lot closer then. Everybody lived together in the same areas. So you had people nipping next door to borrow milk. They knew they were next door neighbours, as well as the husbands going to work together, and they'd be under similar circumstances. So if there was problems at work, then there'd be similar problems at home. They had the same security networks, like the social clubs where they'd go, or the office where they'd go and sit and have a pint after work, discuss the problems, and then the social clubs would put into place that if there was a family that was having certain issues, other families would know about it. There'd be fundraising events and things at these social clubs, so you've got like secure networks getting formed all the time. So in some ways the solidarity is still there in Ashington, but that's just because of the problems that the area's got and the tight networks that are still there, so that your families still know which families are running the place and which ones are the ones to look out for, and you know, there's still that everybody knows each other. There's still a lot of the same families in there, because there's not so much movement, I would say, in Ashington, although the ones that do grow up and move out and go to university usually move on. There's not many new families that do come in, although there is some, but usually related to someone down the line. So there's still that, it's quite stagnant, I would say. There's still that network, there's still that everybody knows each other, but the problems that you're looking at are things like unemployment, or looking at lending each other money and that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely still running through the veins of the place, but not so much from the businesses side of things and the infrastructure, the solidarity on the, I wouldn't say there was much from businesses now. At one time, businesses would look after employers in a way of, you've got a job for life. The coal mining industry's not there, but also other means of work, other means of work, so your butchers, your shop, you have a much higher turnover of staff. If you get a job, you don't necessarily stick with it for more than a couple of years. You move on, you can move in and out of areas. So that kind of solidarity that a business would have with its staff or with the rest of the community isn't there as much as it was.
Okay. So are we talking there about the shift of solidarity from the public sphere to the private sphere, or the shift from public institutions upholding some, without romanticising this, are we talking about public institutions, businesses, collective organisations upholding solidarity in the public sphere, and then people shifting to a very private, family-based account of solidarity? Have other people, I mean, does that bear out other people's experiences? Joe, I mean, you've worked in...
maybe family-based solidarity in terms of very, very wide, extended families in terms of gypsies and travel community, tight-knit family solidarity. There's certainly solidarity struck by communities of interest and then communities of place, and sometimes the two go hand in hand and sometimes they're very polar opposites, and that can happen in a very stark way when you look at a travel site that's close by another geographical place and they're very much not part of the community and there's no solidarity in the place. And there can be very high, using Putnam's terms, bonding capital on the site, and very, very little bridging capital to the wider geographical place. So maybe the very strong glue of wide family-based solidarity is preventing wider community-based solidarity. It's perhaps stopping people looking outside of their community to make stronger ties with their neighbours. Unsurprisingly, because they've been, battered over centuries by wider society and by government. So I'm not trying to apportion blame for gypsies and travellers, not trying to widen out their ties, but I think maybe sometimes that very, very strong bonding capital prevents a better kind of community of place, if you like.
Denis, I suppose just with a project like Equal and the other work that you're doing, have you found means of bridging that very family-based or form of solidarity with global forms of solidarity?
I suppose a lot of what I'm reflecting on is maybe about the differences in the lived experiences of people in communities in Cork and in Ireland to the lived experience of Ashington, a large working class community with a job for life. In Cork, I suppose the 80s were a time of precariousness, and it was to do with the loss of traditional industries in Cork City. So the working classes that were in the city at that time are where the greatest sense of need and difficulty continue to be now. So Knockneedy is one of the areas that was mentioned earlier. And I'm just reflecting on some of what Seamus said about, I think it's a good phrase, Cahill used networks of decency that emerge within any community, whether it's rural or urban, whether it's working class, whether it's in the context of a job for life and solid economy or a very precarious economic situation. So the example that came to mind a while ago was in the 80s, in Knockneedy in particular, but also in Ballyphehane and Togher, there was a massive problem of joyriding. And it came about shortly after the big two industries in Cork, the Ford factory and Dunlop's, failed, shut down completely and let everybody go. And the job for life went with those industries largely. And to a large degree hasn't been replaced since. So in those two communities and others around the city, there was a massive social problem where children, elderly people, women going about their business were knocked down by joyriders being chased by the police, the Gardaí as they're known. There's no joyriding in the city now, to a large degree. There might be very isolated incidents in the whole year. It was so bad in the 80s that one of the natural features of Cork, which has made it what it is, a port city, the harbour, in the middle of the harbour is an island called Spike Island. And it was it was kind of a national joke at the time. It was like Alcatraz for joyriders. So the island, which was an army base, an artillery base, and had been a base for the Navy, it has a very, very long history, but it was a big piece of infrastructure that the British naval service put in place to defend the harbour when, particularly around before World War One. So that island was and the fort within it was converted into a prison, and a lot of the joyriders in Cork City, that's where they served their time. So how did joyriding end in the city? I don't honestly know the answer to that question, but it's largely to do with those networks of decency. It was understood at that time that, you know, this was a disaster for the sons and the children of those families. It was a disaster for the communities themselves. It's just one example. There's lots of other examples you could explore, but that is one that continues to interest me as to how joyriding was completely wiped out in the city. So I've spoken to youth workers. I've spoken to the likes of Tony Fitzgerald, who's a local city councillor, youth worker for many years, and lives to this day in Knocknaheedy, one of the first families to move into that area, because it was a new social housing development where a lot of the families that were living in very poor housing conditions were moved into. And I've also spoken to people who would express the view that there was the other type of solidarity. There was threats of violence against those who might engage in joyriding by political activists who might have Republican tendencies as well. You know, so that's a theory. I don't know the answer to the question. I'd like to hear some of the perspectives of those around the table. It is interesting to me, though, that I'm working in the city. I'm very, very committed to the city, but I'm from a rural background, as is Seamus, as I think is how.
Little bit more.
But the solidarity that I grew up in was in a rural context, and I work, you know, as hard as I can in an urban context now. So I leave that example with you because to my mind it expressed something about that, the decency of ordinary people to respond to their circumstance at a time of severe challenges, when there wasn't an economic solution and there wasn't a political solution, and there was very little interest in those communities. There was a hand wringing, and the cost of the dole in the country was also being expressed at that time as being a concern to the state coffers. And those communities solved that particular problem in a variety of ways, possibly using networks of solidarity that went beyond the family, that connected people together. And it's those networks that, all these years later, are the hubs of family centres, community development projects, youth centres, all those small things that Seamus mentioned earlier that are happening all the time, that are below the radar. They're largely made up of the same type of commitment, maybe the same leadership, the same people who are continuing to do that. So, sorry, that's a long answer to that one.
Yes.
Just like Gibson was talking about some forms of solidarity, they might feel great to those who are included. There's also an element of who's excluded. It's solidarity for people like us. Ballyphehane was one of the first built authority estates in the city, so that immediately created a new community, created solidarity, a whole lot of new families moving in all together, starting family life. And the first things that we created were the church was built, a Roman Catholic church, credit union. It was the second credit union in the state. And this is where some of the people, the older people who use our centre now tell me they wouldn't be allowed into a bank. You had a doorman on the bank, and his job might have been to open the door for some people, but it was to keep the door closed from those who lived in Ballyphehane. Schools. And schools that, sort of in the lifetime of some of my good friends in the city only added the top layer of second level education. So generations of educational disadvantage, and there is some of the people who get education, it's improved, but like it's gone from 5% who have third level education to maybe about 17, kind of pushing it. But you know, two of the people I know who were the first graduates of that full second level education. One is the local headmistress of the local primary school, so she's retained that interest in the area, and it's a really good primary school. And the other is a principal community worker in the city, so she has taken some of that stuff, and there were two of the first graduates from the area. So I think there's that kind of solidarity that's about everyone being thrown in together and having to create something, and then the church was a certain form of solidarity, family was a certain form of solidarity, and then I suppose just to link into Denis's point that in the 80s the kind of organisations like church-based ones and the first community ones were about the people like us, or the people who should tell us how to do things. So the first community organisations were, you know, driven by those who were the most respectable in the community, who told everybody else how it should happen. The ones that started in the 80s and 90s, like the Community Development Project, are about how all of those failed to answer things like jury writing, like unemployment, like educational disadvantage, like the fact that women didn't always want to stay in abusive families, and you know, on from that. So, and like I think Seamus is right, like there is a huge solidarity within the Ballyphehane community, but it has taken a lot of work from some community organisations came out at that time in the 80s and 90s and have a really different idea about community, whose community, where people fit, like one, so you have the first local authority built estate in the city is Ballyphehane, and then you have one of the direct accommodation centres that houses people who are seeking refuge and asylum in the city. And the work that I think some of the newer organisations have done to bring the older organisations along as well, but to try and integrate the fact that there are a whole load of ways of experiencing community, and not all of them are good. And you know, culture sometimes is the way we do things around here, so don't you start doing it differently. But it can also be a very organic, living thing that draws people in.
I think it's very important. I think later on we're going to be watching the film Blueberry Soup, which is about the development of participatory form of democracy in Iceland. And Iceland's a good example of a society which has been quite flexible in its approach to a whole range of different issues, precisely because there have been strong networks that people have been able to draw upon to change the way that people view things. So something like homophobia has been dealt with just by kids telling their parents that it is no longer acceptable to be homophobic. I remember something similar happening in Newcastle in the 90s, where certainly during the 70s and 80s we had a problem with racism at the football club. And I guess as part of a nation building process really, with the rise of the football club through Keegan, it quickly became clear that racism was just completely unacceptable because our best players were black. And as soon as you've got a player like Andy Cole, who is outstanding and brilliant and one of us, but who is also black, it became completely unacceptable to be racist in general. And that was an incredibly quick shift. I can remember probably over the course of 5 years the extent to which people no longer used racist words or words that are perceived to be racist, and even older people quite quickly caught on to the cack-handedness of the language. So you've got the capacity for cultural change, I guess, in one sense, and the incorporation of other people into particular communities. But there is this ever-pressing danger about the forms of community which oppress us and all the rest of it. I suppose Vicky and I share the phenomenon of having gay brothers, and our gay brothers would have suffered badly, I guess, in 1950s coal mining communities. Suffered really badly, I guess, in lots of different respects. So I suppose John at the back, John Baker. I know you've worked a lot on equality, and I think you see equality as a principle being bound up in principles of non-domination and solidarity. The ways in which we can realise solidarity, which are, is there, I suppose, is it that equality checks forms of solidarity, Is it that a commitment to equality prevents the development of coercive, oppressive forms of community and culture? Do you think?
That it's not. I think that certainly, I mean, you're talking about some anti-egalitarian processes in certain forms of solidarity, and so you're implicitly applying an egalitarian criticism to those. So, I mean, it's a tautology that, if you have an egalitarian form of solidarity, it's not going to be oppressive. But
is it not just a form of cohort equality that people are talking about when they're talking about particular communities, like, I suppose, Ashington with its commitment to some form of equality between people that it recognises as being citizens? When you deploy the notion of equality, are you talking about equality in a cosmopolitan sense, I'm just trying to flesh out the difference between that form of equality and your form of equality. Yeah.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think equality applies to everyone. So if you're using communitarian connections to oppress other people, then you're acting in an oppressive way, right? So, I mean, kind of going back to something Joe said, I think, if you've got these conflicts between different groups that each have a sense of solidarity between them, I mean, that raises the question of what counts as some kind of egalitarian resolution of that conflict, and reaching across those boundaries, those differences, which can be economic or can be cultural, or not necessarily dichotomizing just there's economic and there's cultural, but I mean, it certainly can be one of the other types of this. So, sorry, I'm not.
So I suppose what I was trying to lead you into was so we've been talking about solidarity, but you whenever I've talked with you, you've always talked about the priority of equality. That ultimately, in some way, equality underpins all of these other commitments that we might have. I suppose, trying to tease you into.
Well, I think there's an intimate connection between equality and solidarity, but I mean it's a solidarity with strangers in general, rather than a closely bounded solidarity. I mean, I've been thinking, even as we've been talking about, like how. I mean, in some ways, even the idea of solidarity doesn't kind of sit too easily with the idea of just a closely knit community that is based on the idea of oppressing somebody else. So you definitely have different conceptions of solidarity that line up with different understandings of social relations and of more unequal and less unequal social relations. It's complicated, I think.
Can you suggest any instances of forms of solidarity which are compatible with equality in that way, or derived from equality?
Well, I mean, I suppose the. I mean, you look at the expressions of solidarity with migrants and refugees across Europe in the past few months would be kind of good examples, it seems to me, of egalitarian forms of solidarity. I mean, another example that those of us from Ireland would be familiar with was the whole referendum on marriage equality that took place in Ireland last year, and there was kind of great, I mean, it only won by 60% to 40. I mean, it wasn't, that, it wasn't like, the whole country had suddenly realized that it was great to be gay, But nevertheless, there was a huge sense of solidarity among people who had previously come from a lot of different directions in taking shared goal and recognizing different ways of life and different values and so on. So I think that was a good example of egalitarian solidarity.
What are the process? Do you think there are a different set of processes which lead to those expressions of solidarity as opposed to the forms of solidarity that we've been talking about in a more localised, community-based context?
Well, I do think that it has something to do with how you respond to difference, and whether you respond to difference in, with kind of fear and hatred, or whether you respond to it with a kind of openness. And I mean, someone who, I can't remember which of you now, said this whole thing of when you encounter difference, if that makes you reflect on your own position and your own understanding of yourself, that's a really important aspect of then engaging with the other in a way that is going to be, treating them as an equal. Even, not necessarily saying, oh, well, you're an Idaho militiaman, I think that's fantastic, but engaging with them in a way that actually treats them as an equal and says, well, I don't really get what you're doing, but how about giving it a shot, and I'll see what I think about it, and this is where I'm coming from, and that kind of thing.
An interesting book has come out about the marriage referendum in Ireland, and I don't know, would the same kind of principles apply in other countries, or was this a particular Irish campaign done in this particular way? Just thinking about what you're saying about expanding, I think in cosmopolitan terms it's called expanding the circle of the we, so expanding who we think of as part of us. And that the people who led the marriage and equality campaign in Ireland, they personalised it to a huge amount, and they took away the kind of political rhetoric around it and just did a campaign that was very much, I'm your brother, I'm your sister, I'm your friend, I'm your relative, I'm your neighbour, and went door to door with people telling their stories, and put this kind of a very different kind of grassroots mobilisation, that I think really turned the campaign around in the later stages as well. The other thing I was just thinking about from the discussion that's been coming up is how, and something that really affects the area we're working in Cork, how to maintain solidarity and a sense of community under conditions of change. And I think it's come out of discussions around economic precariousness and kind of community challenges. Like what Denis was saying around joyriding, we've just completed a 500 household survey, and we found most people are saying in the area there is no problem with joyriding anymore, but there are big problems around public order, around public drinking and drugs and drug dealing, and I don't know yet that there's a community kind of response to that, even though there are interagency groups working on it. And the biggest issue now in the community in Knocknaheeny is around regeneration and the knocking and rebuilding and the moving out of people from a community that's had a lot of challenges over the years, and like Denis was saying, and similar as well to what Siobhán was saying, huge kind of kinship relationships of solidarity, relationships around the church and schools and community groups, and kind of interdependence in the community. And whether, under conditions of change, does that break apart? Does some of that solidarity go into other areas? So a group of people have been moved from Knocknaheeny into quite a middle class area down the road, and there's been some tensions around that, and some benefits have come out of it as well, and some research that I've seen and that we've done in the area has shown that starting to work as an integrated kind of mixed community, but so there's changes in lots of different ways.
But then maybe, I mean, I'm not sure whether this is kind of getting back to answering what you really were trying to get me to say before. But I mean, under conditions of gross inequality, the possibility of having a sense of solidarity becomes much more difficult too, doesn't it? I mean, what, when you look at the, I mean, in Ireland, the most recent example of the kind of thing that Joe mentioned before was a traveller site that was burned out, and of course, I mean, in a way that the management could be questioned, but the local authority tried to move the surviving families into a temporary holding site in a neighbourhood where the neighbours then barricaded the site so that they couldn't move in. But I mean, that, I see that as a symptom of the inequality. I mean, as well as exacerbating the inequality, but it is a symptom of inequality too. So what look like realistic expectations for establishing solidarity between people are affected by the degree of inequalities between them.
Okay. Which leads nicely on to the film that we're going to show, which is Blueberry Soup. I suppose one of the interesting things about Icelandic society is that despite there being obviously huge inequalities in wealth, there are ways in which Icelandic society has traditionally mitigated those inequalities in a broader social sense. So the refusal to differentiate between formal and informal speech, the refusal to refer to people as Mr. and Mrs. Everybody uses first names. There's this great sense that any attempt to impose that on people, any attempt to change your accent, dialect, these sorts of things are in some way pernicious and anti-Icelandic. Has created a whole range of different resources that they've drawn on in dealing with the problems that they're facing in the present. Now, the position on the Icelandic response to the finance crisis is mixed, and people have got very different ambivalent positions on this. Some people say that it led to this great participatory democracy, a movement towards dealing collectively with the issue. Other people say that the response was just as deficient as in other places. So there has to be caution about romanticising that response. But the film that we're going to show in the question and answer session, which it will lead into with the director of the film, Eileen Jarrett, will flesh out the way in which some people in Icelandic society responded collectively.